Hey everybody, my name is Alex and this is Bento Radio. Now, before we get started, I wanted to remind you that there is a new interview that is the last episode of the podcast. So if you haven't checked that out, it's with a artist by the name of Jessica Luna, aka Eat Slugs. If you're wondering why the fancy print style naming, we get into that in the interview, and it's actually done by me in person. I didn't do it with my avatar. It was too confusing to figure out, and I'm really proud of it. So definitely go check that out and check out Jess's stuff over on the actual blog post that you'll see behind me on bento-box.ghost.io, where you can get all your needs for anything I make. So definitely go check that out. I'm really proud of it again. And now that that's out of the way, let's dive into what I'm talking about this week. And that is a little show that started in 2024 and had its second season just wrap up. And that show is called Dan to Dan. So take it away, with a plot synopsis of Dan to Dan.
While the mission to exorcise Jin, Gigi, and Juji's family home begins, nothing unfolds as expected. The house itself radiates a heavy, hostile energy, and soon the dangers escalate beyond the trio's plan. Momo Ayase narrowly escapes an attempted alien abduction, leaving her shaken but still determined to protect her friends. At the same time, Ken, Okarun, Takakura, and Gigi are cornered by the Kitu family, the strange and menacing landlords of the cursed estate, whose true connection to the town's supernatural underbelly begins to surface. As the conflict deepens, the three discover that their fight isn't limited to a single haunted property. The Kitu family seems to be tied to the very foundation of the town, which is steeped in bizarre folklore and layered with centuries of curses. Momo must sharpen her growing spiritual sensitivity to fend off relentless spirits, while Okarun pushes his unstable turbo granny powers further than ever before. Gigi, caught between fear and loyalty, struggles to master the spiritual inheritance that links him to the house. The trio's survival depends on combining their strengths, but each clash leaves them more entangled in the mysteries that surround their hometown. Every battle pulls them closer to a larger truth, that the supernatural forces hunting them are part of something vast, an ongoing struggle where aliens, spirits, and ancient curses overlap. By the end, they've won only a temporary reprieve, realizing their exorcism has shaken the fragile balance of their world. The town's secrets are far from resolved, and darker trials are already closing in.
Now that the plot synopsis is out of the way, I want to start talking about Dan to Dan by talking about Shonen Jump as an institution that shapes the kinds of shonen anime we tend to see, not in general, but that gets super popular. Think your Naruto's, your Bleach, your any of the big four, even things like Chainsaw Man or Kaiju Number 8 were in Shonen Jump. And the reason I want to talk about that is because I think that part of Dan to Dan's genius is that it doesn't do so much of that, and this is also true of another kind of modern Shonen Jump that got an anime called Undead Unluck, and both of those properties can attribute their success both in different directions, but in the same direction on some level. Where Dan to Dan has a much more modern feel, Undead Unluck has a much more retro mid-2000s anime vibe that Dan to Dan doesn't really have. When you're watching Undead Unluck, you feel like you're watching something from the early 2000s. When you're watching Dan to Dan, you feel like you're watching something from now. It feels very, now coded, even though they do some pretty clever tricks, which I'll talk about in a second, to get around some nowisms, specifically cell phones. But the long and short of it is that Dan to Dan was made by somebody who was originally an assistant to the author of Chainsaw Man. And He's tried a couple things. He tried a bunch of things, actually, and bounced around until he showed his editor the rough draft of what he wanted to do with Dandadan. And the two things that his editor told him was, go and read, the urban myth is, go and read 100 shoujo manga, but he could have said that. He could have just said, go read a bunch of shoujo manga, essentially, is what he said. And just draw without thinking too much about the end point. And what the editor did there is really interesting, because he did something like Naruto or Bleach or any of the big four do almost instinctively. Dragon Ball Z was actually kind of forced to do this because Dragon Ball Z was so unendingly popular by the time they got to Cell that they just couldn't stop it. Dragon Ball Z, in its day, was an engine of an entire universe of business and a universe of industry in the anime and nerd world. That's how you get to Majin Buu, and that's how you get to now Dragon Ball Super and all of that stuff. That's how that property outlived its creator, because it's the Dragon Ball property is an industry into and unto itself. And I've always talked about, when I talk about long-running Shonen Jump adaptations, that I love the fact that they run for a long time, specifically because you're forced to do this thing when you're running something for a really long time that's really specific and interesting. And that really specific, interesting thing is you have to build out the world in a way that's so much different from what you're used to building with a shorter storyline. And if you look at some of the more recent Shonen Jump properties, look at something like Kaiju number 8 is actually a good example. If you look at Demon Slayer, those creators are in and out in terms of the size and scope of a show. Even something like My Hero has a much shorter, smaller scope than something like One Piece or something like Bleach or something even like Naruto. It draws from those things, but it's very much contained, at least currently with the current end of the manga. It's contained to a very specific period of time in those characters' lives. You're not following characters from early age to adulthood. So a perfect example is in Dragon Ball Z, you follow Gohan from basically being an infant to being an adult, to being in his late 20s at the very least. That's not something that you're getting with very oftentimes with modern shonen anime, because they don't. It's not that I don't think the person behind the manga behind Demon Slayer or the manga behind Kaiju number 8 couldn't do that stuff or had no interest in doing that stuff. They just don't want to sit in those stories in that way for that amount of time, because if you look at any of the big four, they all have tremendous amount of world building that's not necessary. Everyone's favorite thing to bring up as an example of a good, fun filler episode is the driver's license episode of Dragon Ball Z. This thing doesn't need to exist, but it's so fun that it's additive to the world, and it feels like an acknowledgement of the basic truth of these guys are not normal. They're not interacting with the rest of the world. They're interacting as little as possible. So when Goku and a giant green slug man show up and need to get driver's licenses, it gets weird, because it just gets weird because they're not going to the grocery store every day kind of thing. Certainly not for either of them. And you don't think about that. So the comedy and the world building comes when they get the chances to do that. In the Dragon Ball world, people are much closer to the person like Krillin is, or Hercule, aka Mr. Satan, is. The reality of the Dragon Ball world is that Krillin, the guy who gets annihilated all the time in that show, hilariously lampooned by Dragon Ball Abridged, is actually probably the strongest human being on Earth. Sit with that a second. It's the little bald guy is just the strongest human. Everybody else is something else. He can stand on the same stage as the rest of them. And there's a great, and this is a weird aside, but it proves what I want to talk about here. There's a great scene in Dragon Ball Z where we haven't seen the gang for a while, and Krillin has grown hair, and he looks very stately. And you're led to believe that he's a chief of police somewhere. He has a big, important job with a big, important paycheck because he's just the strongest human alive. It is completely unhinged, but he is the strongest human alive. And that's really one of the only times they really hint at, oh, Krillin's not a big deal here, but he's a big deal. Even Yamcha is kind of just a punk. He's technically one of the Z fighters, but he's a baseball guy. Like, it's not, he has, and actually even Yamcha has enough physical prowess to be a top tier baseball player. It's wild. But my point is that kind of world building happens when you have just ridiculous amounts of episodes and hundreds of episodes in the adaptation specifically to fill, because you have to put something there. And in the old times of the Big Four, they weren't adhering to a seasonal structure. Technically there were seasons, but you're not gonna really focus on that ever. So they had to put something on television every week. They had to map stuff out, and they would get, and the origin of filler is they needed to fill in spaces because they needed to wait for the source material to get sufficiently ahead enough to be adaptable at a pace that made sense. And one of the interesting things that's happening now is the new gen shonen is ending pretty quickly in comparison, and you have this gap of when the manga ends for something like Jujutsu Kaisen, which is over. Jujutsu Kaisen has moved on to its second, to a sequel series, but the anime is still going. There's still stuff to be done with the anime. And so you have this two-tiered system now that's very different from what it used to be. But the thing that shonen anime used to be for guys is, in a way, what shoujo anime used to be for the female readership and audience. And the lines have never really existed. Everybody always read everything, especially if you were deeply interested in the medium, because you were interested in what was happening on both sides. I read Kerekano. I read and watched Kerekano. I read and watched Dragon Ball. The same was true in the opposite direction, too. But shonen has had this chokehold on the industry for a really long time. And that has to do with a couple of interesting things. A lot of really popular, part of it is a lot of really popular shoujo stuff can be really toxic. Like a new show coming out, I believe next year, maybe? I'm not sure. Is an adaptation of a thing from the mid-90s called Hanakimi. And Hanakimi, I remember it being like, this is a wild thing. Because lots of shoujo plays the part of wish fulfillment for the female audience. It played the part of essentially romantic fantasy wish fulfillment. There's a lot of reverse harem things. There's a lot of abusive boyfriend, but I can fix him and secretly he loves me. That's not, and it's not, that's a thing that kind of wish fulfillment is the equivalent of power fantasy things you see in something like My Hero Academia, where a to his detriment aggressively normal kid gets superpowers, which is full wish fulfillment. But the thing that is always a letdown, but it's always dealt with ultimately in shonen anime largely, is coupling and romance. So if you look at something like Bleach, for example, very early on in Bleach, Orihime, the orange one from the leak meme, if you're not overly familiar with Bleach, is positioned as a love interest for Ichigo. right down to the color scheme, because their hair is both the same color. And they go through this whole emotional arc with her brother very early on in the show. And then they just Tite Kubo just doesn't do much with that for a really long time. Cut to the ending of that manga, and they jump forward a little bit, and Orihime and Ichigo have settled down and have a family, and their kid is a Soul Reaper. It feels out of nowhere if you're not overly familiar with the very early parts of the show and the kind of coding they're doing with that character. And if you look at other shonen properties, a lot of shonen properties have a little bit of the same problem to more and lesser degrees. Naruto, for all of its good qualities, it has a centralized romantic relationship that's very abusive, even in its current form, in the form of Boruto, which feels just like, why is Sakura with Sasuke at all? He seems like an emotionally unavailable weirdo and asshole in my mind. But they play that off. Kishimoto plays that off to try and make Sakura relatable. It backfires. Sakura is, there's a bunch of things that make Sakura insufferable and a bad attempt at writing a female character. Regardless of Kishimoto having stated, I wanted to make a cool, badass female character that girls could look up to, Sakura is not that. But if you generate in the next gen realm, if you look at Nobara from JJK, she's a lot of what Sakura is, but with the self-confidence dial cranked past 11. She has a lot of the same tendencies that Sakura does. She has the temper, she has the brashness, but she has the self-confidence to not feel like she needs to mitigate it. And that makes her a much more interesting character than your standard Team 7 girl insert character, because the trio from Jujutsu Kaisen is very much Team 7 for a new generation. But the reason that so oftentimes female characters, not female characters, but romance-oriented plotline don't hold in shonen action shows is because that's not what they're concerned with. The romance plot in a shonen show is not what the show is built around. Or they try to build it around it, and it sucks. Bakuman manages to... It's from the creators of Death Note, and it's like their love letter to making manga. But Bakuman and the other show that they made, the one with Angels of Death and the crystals and the nightmares, and that real edgelordy show from a couple years ago, when they're centralizing romance, it feels like they're instrumentalizing the female character in a way that they're making them a plot device and not letting them have a kind of agency and awareness that makes you want to root for the relationship even. The Bakuman comes off as so boring and weird because it doesn't, like, the romantic relationship between the two romantic leads of that show, it doesn't feel good to watch. It feels too unnecessary and too manipulated by the show to make the show happen. And don't get me wrong, there are things in the way won't they shonen of shoujo anime, which is definitely in Dandadan. It's not great either. It has the same effect as the shonen power creep and the long drawn out arcs of shonen, but playing on a different emotional thing. And the thing about Dandadan is that by building the story primarily around the romantic relationship between Momo and Okarun, or Momo and Ken Takakura, who she calls him Okarun at first because she can't call him by his first name because she has a schoolgirl crush on a 1980s Yakuza actor, which is hilarious and great. But the thing about building the story around this core romantic relationship is that they're tricking the audience almost into letting themselves care about the romantic relationship in a shonen property. They are accomplishing something that other shonen, even other shonen now, chief among them, Kaiju number 8, just aren't interested in doing. But if they were interested in doing it, you would have a much stronger emotional connection to specific characters much earlier. So in Kaiju number 8, the reason why Kafka is so dead set in the very beginning of that show, spoiler alert for basically anything I talk about on this podcast, but specifically in this case, Kaiju number 8, the reason why he's so dead set on getting into the Kaiju fighting force, the Kaiju self-defense force, whatever they call it in that show, I forget, is that his childhood friend and childhood crush is in the self-defense force and has been for years by the time he makes it in. And you find out that she was holding on to that promise and all that stuff, but they always keep that on the back burner. The relationship between Mina and Kafka in Kaiju number 8 never feels as solid or real as the relationship between Okarun and Momo in Dandadan. And the reason for that is, in Kaiju number 8, their relationship is a side plot. It is a piece of the story that they use to get the story going. In Dandadan, the relationship and the progression of the relationship between Momo and Okarun is the point. Now, I think that Dandadan has a similar problem that it, at least from what I've seen in the manga, is starting to encounter that it inherited shonen from shoujo plot lines, which is that they're dragging out the confession and the consecrating, for lack of a better word, of the relationship. One of the best things about Karakano, and I'm going to do a little shoujo corner here, one of the best things about Karakano is that show and the property, the show and the manga, while they have very different storylines, are both less interested in the beginning of a relationship and more interested in the relationship and end of a relationship, part of romance. In the show and in the manga, the characters sleep together pretty quickly, and they kind of blow past the how do we relationship kind of thing. Shoujo anime almost has an origin story problem from the way I see it. And I'm sure there's lots of shoujo anime that gets way past this, and because there's lots of shoujo anime and shoujo manga out there in the world, I haven't read absolutely everything, so I can't say for sure. But shoujo as a genre has a kind of origin story problem in the way that Spider-Man does, and that so much of shoujo is about the very start of a relationship, not being in it with the other person. And part of the genius of Dandadan is, another part of the genius of Dandadan actually, is that it gives you something to do. It gives your brain something to focus on in that beginning part. So it feels less drawn out. They feels less torturous than it would otherwise in a shoujo anime. That's the entire point. And that dynamic of building a shonen anime around a shoujo core gives Dandadan this heart and this understanding of relationships and friend groups and interpersonal relationships outside of just complex interpersonal relationships, outside of just romantic ones. You look at the relationship between Okarun and Gigi, where Gigi clearly has feelings for Momo, but he understands that that's not reciprocated. He also understands that they are reciprocated for Okarun, and Okarun also likes Momo, so he very willingly becomes not okay, but accepts the sidecar seat, so to speak. And Ira as a character is really fighting with herself to not be the cutesy pretty girl so much, and clearly has feelings for Okarun in some direction, but she more pokes at him that way to fuck with Momo. And as you add characters onto that, you create this kind of found family and a friend group that has all the weird interpersonal and weird connections of a friend group. If you think about your group of friends when you were younger, when you were a teenager, everything felt so much weightier and so much more complicated, and you had all these weird intros to people and histories with people, and there were the two that were really close friends, not technically dating, but everybody knew not to touch that relationship with a 10-foot pole because there's something there that neither of them are necessarily fully willing to explore. That's Okarun and Momo. People are okay just being alone. There are people okay who aren't being alone, but they're struggling to figure it out. It's impressive to see a shonen anime, ostensibly, and not that the genre labels mean much anymore, but ostensibly a genre that's pretty interested in showcasing relationship, but isn't always interested in showcasing the possibility for the complexity in those kinds of relationships. Just so incredibly nail that entirely. And I'm not talking a whole lot about the specific plot points here, because in a really interesting way, as much fun as the Mongolian death worm, the kaiju thing at the end, the evil eye, which is really the evil eye arc, is really the meat of the show. The Mongolian death worm is like the ramp in, and the kaiju thing is clearly going to be a much more extended arc there when it comes back in, I think, 2026. But the arcs are really not the point. And I had a really interesting response to the Let's Play DDR with Classical Composers training arc, 2.5 episodes that they had there in the middle of the Evil Eye arc. And that was, I really didn't like it. And I paused to think, why don't I like this? And that's the reason I didn't like it was because that particular section is so indicative of what you get in other shonen. And if I want a training arc like that, you can go find it plenty of other places in whatever quantity or size or runtime you want. You can find a training arc. I'm not interested in watching to learn the Rasengan reskinned as other characters. I'm interested in that clear display of this is the relationship this is what these relationships are capable of doing in this show when everybody just complicitly trusts each other. And what's his face? The new character who they introduced, mecha nerd guy. I forget his name. Oh, what's his name? When they introduced Kinta and like Momo's so, what's your problem, weirdo? And Kinta's trying so hard to get on their level, and they like Momo just won't let him until all of a sudden she does, and then all of a sudden he's just part of the gang now. And it's so, the author feels like they have such an understanding of relationships and relationship dynamics young as a teenager. And if you think about it, those relationship dynamics don't change all that much. They calm down, they even out, but they don't, like, your weirdo friends when you're a teenager will still always be your weirdo friends. My friend who got her tongue pierced when she was in high school one year, and I kept telling her, hey, stop taking that thing out, or eventually you're going to stab yourself in the mouth. And she's like, no, it'll be fine. And then a couple days later, she left the school, pulled out the tongue ring, I think at lunch, which I thought was hilarious that she waited until lunch, and she tried to put it in, just fully stabs herself in the tongue. Immediately. I still talk to that person. I'm not going to mention her name here. I still talk to that person on time to time. But the funniest, by far, part of it is her now long-term boyfriend, who she's lived with for years, goes into those comment sections where we have these wild conversations, and he's like, when did you do this? And she's like, oh, I've always been about this. I constantly force him to learn something new about her every couple months. It's hilarious. But that's to say that this is a experience that people that like the found familyness of this show. This show uses its overarching plot structure to facilitate is so true to what happens and what's happened for a long time in people's lives on larger and smaller scales that it's really incredible. And that's the true magic of this show, is that it's not even the shoujo romance at the core of it, although that is a huge part of it. It's the fact that they assemble this gang of weirdos and let them hang out and play off each other in ways you never expect. They may all be centralized around either Okarun or Momo, but they all cross-pollinate and they all hang out, and Kinta freaking goes at Gigi, and Ira, what the hell is Kinta's problem? They're so only focused on whoever side of that core relationship they came in on. Like I said, though, it's really at least from what I've seen in the manga, it's really, from what I've seen, you're really starting to feel Okarun and Momo not being in a relationship, not having truly confessed to each other in a reciprocal way. I think Okarun has confessed to Momo, and Momo is, I think, still a pygmy person, which means she's real tiny, she's rocket sized, but she hasn't confessed back. And the show's property, I think, feels to me from, I don't read this manga regularly, but it feels to me from the outside as if it's dragging it out, which would make sense from a shoujo, especially early era shoujo perspective, because that's the part of the story that's keeping you coming back. Like I said, I think it can be more interesting to sit in a relationship and see how it goes, because I think that's a more interesting dynamic than just talking about how two characters got together, because that's done so often and so regularly in not just anime, but basically every rom-com is about the characters chasing each other down, essentially, at some level of absolute psychosis in both sides. The truly great rom-coms that you remember very often incorporate more of a full-on relationship, like the one with Ryan Gosling and Emma Stone and all that stuff. I forget what it's called, but it's really an iconic one. That one, Ryan Gosling is brought home to be met by Steve Carell, who he's teaching how to be a player on the side as a boyfriend. It moves past the meet cuteness of it and just jumps to being really about the core romance there. And even if you look at lots of rom-coms, the parts that people remember are characters actually interacting and actually having a relationship. And the reason why to me feels like the core relationship in Dan to Dan is being dragged out in the manga at this point is that they've decided to pull the trigger and make a consequence, affirm Okarun's feelings out loud. Where the anime is right now, although they just had a heartbreak moment for Momo, which I'm sure they'll move past, because another wildly bad thing about the anime adaptation especially is where they choose to do the cutoffs of seasons is storytelling violence. The first season cut off essentially with Momo about to be assaulted in a bathhouse. This season cuts off with Momo arriving at a romantic misunderstanding. And that's that show playing with the anime-only viewers' emotions and being like, hey, come back next year or come back in 6 months and we'll tell you what the hell happens here. And I don't think that's good pacing, or I think it's the worst kind of cliffhanger stuff you can do, really. But I was saying, because they've added this consequence, ticking time clock essentially, for Momo, they create a dynamic of now people, I'm in the Dan to Dan Reddit actually, and people are constantly theorizing about when Momo will confess. But if you look at even the early parts of the anime, both of them figure out that they're really into each other pretty quickly. And everybody around them figures this out also pretty quickly. And they're just not engaging with it. No one is really engaging with it. And a couple people are hoping that they don't engage with it at all, so they have a chance to engage with their feelings about Momo or Okarun. Both of them. And it gives the romance a chance to be much more casual, but still give you cute moments. This is a thing that's also true. And I think that modern anime romances are doing this for a very specific reason. Modern anime and manga romances are doing this for a very specific reason. And that's that they want to, I think there's an urge to bring the temperature down on fictional romances, to make them feel more real. Because I think over time that's become more of the fantasy. And I think that's probably fairly healthy. But if you look at My Dress-Up Darling, even more than in Dandadan, people kind of explicitly say it at many points in My Dress-Up Darling. Marin and Gojo are just an item. And it's understood by every single side character in that show that, listen, we can all fuck around on the side and couple up and break up and all that stuff. But we're all looking at each other, and we're all silently making a pact right now to protect this relationship. We are not going to fuck with either of these two people. And if any of us do, the rest of us have license to immediately, at the very least, pull them aside and be like, what the fuck are you doing, man? Like, they're clearly a thing. They're just in their feelings about being a thing. Don't fuck with that. There's too much bad in the world. We can't mess this up for them or us. And that feels an awful lot like what's happening in Dandadan. And at the very end, when they introduce, I'm going to try this name for the first time out loud, Vamoa, and you get the heartbreaking kiss scene. The way they handle that is Vamoa has no idea what the dynamic is. She just woke up, thinks somebody saved her, and kissed a dude. That's an acceptable way to do that. Ira gloms on to Okarun, but there's still an understood barrier there. Gigi does not come anywhere close to truly approaching Momo. There's a protective field around Momo and Okarun's relationship because everybody takes one look at them and it's like, oh, they're each other's. We don't have the right to truly interject in that, even if we may want to. And when Okarun finally confesses to Momo and makes it like a real thing that like Momo has to respond to and Momo doesn't, is the threat to the status quo. And in doing that, in the manga, they haven't gotten to that point in the anime yet. They like I've been saying this entire time, this show and Dandadan as a property is a thing that is dealing with relationships. And it's dealing with the complexity and the balancing act of relationships on every level, really. Maybe with the exception of the parental one. At least so far, from what I've seen. And the last frontier they have there is the realizing of the romantic relationship between Momo and Okarun. But typically in shoujo anime, cementing that relationship happens at the end or very close to the end. Shoujo anime that cement that relationship really concretely aren't as common as the They Won't They Until They Kiss at the End ones. What I told you about Carcano is not common in shoujo from all the ones I've read, and I've read a bunch. I've read and watched a bunch. And very often in shoujo, or even, not even shoujo, but harem anime, you don't get the conclusion and the fully fleshed out romantic relationship unless it's a flash forward at the end of Love Hina. They show that Neru and what's-his-face are a couple, and they've become this echo of a similar couple that they knew when they were young. And if I had one big knock against Dandadan, it would be this, and that is that by bristling at the typical Shonen Jump scaffolding training arc is because I expect more out of this show. And the second season feels much less exciting of a watch than the first season did for me, but I still really liked it. The thing that threw me off was the training arcness and the fact that they even went to a training ground, more or less. And I think that the show has built such a reputation for handling its core shonenness so differently than so much of what's out there that when I was presented with, here's a training arc, it didn't matter that it was different or it was its take on a training arc. I had no interest in seeing pure training arc out of for two characters. It just didn't do it for me. I watched those episodes, but mostly because I was curious to see if there was anything in the middle there that was interesting, but there really wasn't. That and the cliffhangers of the show, which drive me up a wall because I think they're bad and ultra manipulative. But so that's my thoughts on the second season of Dandadan. If you like this episode, you can find other episodes wherever you find podcasts, or if you're watching this right here on YouTube, you can find it on YouTube. If you're not watching this, you can go to YouTube and you can search Bento Radio and find the podcast to watch it over here on YouTube. You can also find everything that I'm responsible for, Bento Radio, the first season of the webcomic, writing about anime, as well as that little extra blurb for the last episode, which was my interview with Jessica Luna, over on bento-box.ghost.io. There should be a QR code on the screen right now that lets you just scan it with your phone if you're not watching this on your phone and go right there. So definitely check that out. And with that said, I've been Alex. This has been Bento Radio. I will talk at you next time.